Thank you, Bruno, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. In this talk, my primary aim is to introduce a manuscript, a majmua kept at the University Library of Tübingen. And the majority of this manuscript consists of various inshāʼ treatises by the 13th century Anatolian author, Ḥusām al-Dīn Khūyī. And it is safe to say that Khūyī was introduced to the broader academic community by Bruno de Nicola, particularly in his articles and most recently in his book on the Qawā'id of Kastamonu. So he's definitely the authority on this subject. This is not to say, of course, that Khūyī would have been entirely unknown, especially among Turkish and Iranian scholars. Osman Turan described his works as early as 1958, and two of Khūyī's treatises were published in 1963, so 5 years later, by Adnan Sadık Erzi. But it was Soghra Abbaszadeh who provided the standard edition of all his works in 2000. And examining the list of his works, it becomes evident that Khūyī was one of the most prolific writers of the inshāʼ genre in the medieval period. And his reputation in later centuries is well attested by the significant number of surviving manuscripts in both Iran and Turkey. In addition to his inshāʼ treatises, he composed an Arabic Persian vocabulary entitled Nasib al-Fityan. And Bruno noted that Khūyī based this work on Abu Nasr Farahi's Nisab al-Sibyan, a textbook for students of Arabic language and prosody, expanding it with Persian interlinear translation. And this approach is also quite evident in the 4th chapter of Khūyī's Nuzhat al-Kuttāb wa Tuḥfat al-Aḥbāb or al-Aḥbāb, where he provides aspiring scribes with Arabic poetic verses accompanied by Persian translations to embellish their writings. Additionally, he most likely composed Divan, though unfortunately no information about this collection is available beyond its mere existence. But for the purposes of this presentation, I will focus solely on his inshāʼ works, which represent the most significant portion of his literary output. And I wish to introduce and offer a preliminary analysis of 3 hitherto unpublished inshāʼ works of Khūyī. But what is inshāʼ? In its broadest sense, inshāʼ refers to the style or composition of documents or letters. In a larger literary context, however, it constitutes a distinct genre that encompasses texts on fiscal and legal administration, essays on the principles of epistolography, and treatises on the qualifications and training of scribes. And these manuals were used to instruct and train Divan officials. But in addition to their literary and didactic purposes, they often included exemplary decrees, letters, and other correspondence as models to emulate. And treatises dealing with the drafting of royal decrees, diplomatic correspondence, and bureaucratic appointments are undoubtedly the best represented of the various definitions of inshāʼ, which can be divided into 3 broad categories: didactic texts, collections of model documents, or, which was the most common, the combination of both. And Khūyī's works are particularly notable in this regard, as they primarily consist of model letters, decrees, and poetic citations with minimal explanatory commentary. So let's start with what we know about Khūyī. So Ḥusām al-Dīn Hasan bin Abdul Mumin Khūyī's Nisba indicates an association with the city of Khoi in the province of Western Azerbaijan in modern-day Iran. However, according to his own account, he was raised in Sivas, a fact he mentions in the introduction of his work Mu'tamasat, which contains around 100 qata'is and ruba'is composed by Khūyī himself, expressing requests or supplications. However, it remains unclear whether he was born in Khoi and later moved to Sivas, or whether his family had already settled in Sivas before his birth. Unfortunately, there is no definitive evidence to support either scenario. Interestingly, the entry on Khūyī in the Lovetname of Dekhoda states that he was from Mardin. While Dekhoda does not provide a source for his claim, the same information appears in Agha Buzorg's Al-Variya, suggesting that Dekhoda may have relied on this work. However, Agha Buzorg himself does not cite a source, leaving the origin of this assertion uncertain. The next verifiable detail about Khūyī's life is his relocation to Kastamonu, where he lived during the late 13th and early 14th centuries. He served as the head of chancery at the Chobanid court, as evidenced by his own statement in the Nuzhat al-Kuttāb, where he says that this humble servant rose from the depths of obscurity to the pinnacle of fame and was honored with the position of secretary in his exalted court. His being the dedicatee of the work, the Chobanid Muzaffar ad-Din bin Yablak Arslan bin Alpirek, the Sepahdar or military governor of Kastamonu, from whom Khūyī derived his lakab, Muzaffari. The colophon of the Nuzhat al-Kuttāb indicates that it was composed in the month of March, or March-April 1285. Khūyī was most likely appointed to this position as head of the chancery no later than autumn 1284, as Muzaffar ad-Din led a campaign against the twin castles at Gideros in October 1284, successfully capturing them. And Khūyī composed a fatname, a letter of victory about this event, which he included in his next work, the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il, Fawā'id al-Fażā'il. Khūyī completed this treatise on the principles of letter writing a few months after the Nuzhat al-Kuttāb, as he states that it was finished in early September 1285. The Qawā'id al-Rasā'il was composed at the request of friends, suggesting that it was used within a relatively small circle of colleagues. He later dedicated it to the last Chobanid ruler, Amir Mahmud, who assumed control of the region of Kastamonu after his father's, Muzaffar ad-Din's death in 1291, so 6-7 years after its completion. Whereas the Nuzhat al-Kuttāb aimed to provide munshis with a variety of Quranic verses and hadith quotations they can use when composing letters, the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il was more comprehensive, covering the khatabat, or the proper forms of address for dignitaries, and model letters for appointments, with a stronger focus on state documents. The Nuzhat al-Kuttāb likely served as an introduction to Khūyī's art and talent at the Chobanid court, possibly as a means of securing employment in Kastamonu. The Qawā'id al-Rasā'il, however, appears to have been a response to an administrative necessity, as the expanding Chobanid territories in the region required the chancery to be able to provide standardized templates for state documents and official correspondence. It should be noted that the Nuzhat al-Kuttāb was by far the most popular work of Khūyī based on the number of surviving copies. It appears that there was a demand for these writing manuals, as Khūyī composed 2 additional works. The first, written in 1291, is titled Ḥusām al-Rasā'il wa Nujūm al-Fażā'il. And like his earlier work, this was also composed at the request of friends and colleagues, and has survived in only 1 manuscript from the second half of the 15th century. And among Khūyī's works, the Ḥusām al-Rasā'il is the most focused on divaniyat, or state documents. And both this work and the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il were clearly intended for the secretaries of the Chobanid chancery, as they were composed at the request of peers and both focuses particularly on appointment letters. And this emphasis testifies to the existence of a sprawling Chobanid court and the intention to establish a local administration. Bruno had made the observation that each text contains a supplemental element, suggesting that they were meant to complement one another. Furthermore, given that the Ḥusām al-Rasā'il and the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il were composed 6 years apart, there must have been a pressing need for training scribes and officials in drafting documents. And this necessity reflects the rudimentary state of the chancery in Kastamonu, and we can infer that similar conditions likely prevailed in other provincial centers at the time. In contrast, Khūyī's other works focus more on diplomatic and private correspondence, including his final treatise, Digonjat al-Kuttāb wa Munjat al-Talib, and it was composed in September 1309, and it's essentially an abridged version of the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il. Uniquely, this work was not dedicated to a ruler or prince, but to his son, Nasrallah. And as Bruno noticed, the editor of Khūyī's works, Soghra Abazadeh, incorrectly states that the work was dedicated to the author's father. And this confusion likely arises from the preface, in which Khūyī writes that, and I quote, "A brief work on the subject of correspondence in a novel style and an extraordinary manner with utmost brevity was written so that when by the grace of the Almighty, he," meaning his son, Nasrallah, "attains the worthiness to serve in the secretary's office and advances from the depths of memorizing isolated words to the heights of comprehending the practices of scribes, he may acquire complete proficiency in the art of correspondence and the knowledge of addressing properly through familiarity with this brief work. May he remember this father with favorable mention and sincere prayer. When the subject moved from the confines of drafting into the spacious realm of completion, and the blossoms of this budding sapling adorned the flowers of the garden of virtues, this compilation was named Unjat al-Kuttāb wa Munjat al-Talib." So the father in question was actually Khūyī himself. And given the date of composition of the work, it can be suggested that Khūyī died sometime after 1309, although no further details are known. Another work, the Kanz al-Lataif or Kanz al-Balagha, is occasionally attributed to Khūyī, and this collection of model letters survives in 3 manuscripts, but as far as I'm aware, only the latest of these explicitly names Khūyī as its author. And given this discrepancy and the date of the latest manuscript, which is the late 16th century, I would hesitate calling it a genuine work of Khūyī. But let's turn now to the 2 lesser known works of Khūyī, the Ṭirāz al-Rasā'il and the Rawā'i'u al-afkār fi badā'i'u al-ash'ār, in which we can find further insights into his life and work. So these poetic compositions are preserved in a manuscript kept at the University Library of Tübingen, dated June 1471. And according to the library's catalog, the manuscript was acquired by Ewald Oheim in Skopje in 1916 and was subsequently purchased from him. But who is this Oheim? So before the outbreak of the First World War, Oheim served as editor-in-chief of the newspaper Berliner Abendpost. And during the war, he became an Unteroffizier der Landsturm, a special office of the German army. And in this capacity, he was the editor of the Kriegszeitung, or war newspaper of the 11th Army, initially published in Hungary, but later in Skopje. And this is how Oheim ended up there. And even after the 11th Army underwent reorganization in the spring of 1916, leading to a change in its name and the newspaper's title in early 1917, Oheim continued as its editor in Skopje. So this is the time when he managed to acquire many Turkish and Persian manuscripts. Notably, he corresponded with the renowned Turkologist Rudolf Tschudi. And actually, the Central Library of the University of Zurich received its most significant Turkish manuscript collection from Oheim, who sold 36 manuscripts through Tschudi, then a professor of Turkish at Basel University. It's therefore likely that Tschudi also facilitated the sale of this particular manuscript to the Tübingen University Library. The manuscript was copied by Ahmad bin Hamza Aflaki al-Arifi, and he is explicitly mentioned as the copyist of the fifth work in the manuscript, but considering the uniformity of handwriting in the other works, it can be asserted that he is the copyist of the entire collection, the entire Majmu'ah. And these are the 6 works it contains, and as you can see, 4 of them are the works of Khūyī. 3 colophons provide dates showing that the manuscript was copied throughout the second half of 875, which is the first half of 1471. And Aflaki completed copying the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il, so the second work, at the end of Ramadan, the Rawā'i'ul al-afkār in Shawwal, and the fifth work, the Shihab al-Khasi's Rawdat al-Insan, on the 6th of Dhul Hijjah. Unfortunately, we have no information about the manuscript's previous owners, as there are no ownership remarks or seals. The manuscript contains only a few paratextual elements, mostly scattered baits from poets such as Rumi and Moisi, but nothing else. The first known reference to this majmu'ah comes from Iraj Afshar, not surprisingly, who mentioned it in an article published in Yagma in 1974. And his article provides an account of a seminar he attended at the University of Tübingen, and he introduces several manuscripts from the university's collection, including this one. So with this background in mind, let us now turn our attention to the 2 inshāʼ works in verse. So the Ṭirāz al-Rasā'il consists of 3 parts. As stated in the introduction, its purpose is to provide examples for embellishing the openings of private letters, or mufawazat-e ikhwan. And the first part contains 58 Arabic 2-line verses of supplications, or du'awat, intended for use at the beginning of letters, each starting with, maybe you can see here if it's not too small, all of them starts with Salam Allahumma. And the second part comprises 5-line verses of oaths, or qasamiyat. And while the third contains the 3 lines oaths. And it's worth noting that the copyist made an error in either the content or the title. You can see that the second subheading announces the beginning of 3-line verses, but the copied text contains the 5-line oaths instead. And these oaths are addressed to the beloved, but predominantly to a master, expressing complaints about the suffering of separation, the deprivation of his master's companionship, description of impatience, waiting, and longing for a meeting. And this is what's called the ishtiyāq, or expressions of eagerness, by the munshis of the period, and it was an integral part at the end of the protocol of private letters, or ikhwaniyat. And the text also includes requests for a response and seeking prayers for the addressee, all presented in the unique form of oaths. And accordingly, the 5-line oaths begin with Bekhoda'ike, while the 3-line oaths begin with Bedan Khoda'ike because of the prosody. And in all 3 sections, the verses are arranged in alphabetical order. But what makes these qasamiyat particularly intriguing is not their appearance. Such poems of oaths were known, but the fact that the entire compilation is devoted to a single theme, the ishtiyāq, which appears to be unique. And these verses not only adhere to conventional formulas of HTL, but also allude to the author's personal hardships, going beyond standard expressions of longing. And they also include laments that the addressee does not remember or respond to the author. And if you consider the final two-line supplication at the end of the first part of the work, which contains the word sadr, which at the time was an honorific for a number of important notables, it is conceivable that this work was composed for a high-ranking official with the possible intention of reconciling with the addressee in the hope of regaining a lost position or perhaps renewing the companionship of his master. Therefore, this suggests that this work predates Khūyī's time in Kastamonu, where he was undoubtedly in a relatively secure position and was likely written earlier than the previously described and known works of his, which were all composed in Kastamonu. In total, the Ṭirāz al-Rasā'il contains 290 verse lines attributed to Khūyī. His pen name, Ḥusām, appears only once in this same Arabic couplet of the first section. And while Khūyī claims that these verses were composed spontaneously, or as he called it, irtijalan, this assertion should be taken with some skepticism. Notably, two of his oaths also appear in the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il, one of them you can see here. And since we lack a definitive date for the Ṭirāz al-Rasā'il, we cannot determine whether these oaths first appeared in that work or in the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il, which raises doubts about their purported spontaneity. Although I am not a literary historian, but as far as I remember from my earlier studies, I cannot recall earlier mentions or uses of solasi or khomasi as distinct poetic forms in Persian literature, so this question would also worth to be further pursued. The circulation and reception of this work remain uncertain, but this can also be said about all of Khūyī's works. So far, I found no evidence that these verses, described as ornaments of epistles, Ṭirāz al-Rasā'il in the title, were incorporated into later inshāʼ or historiographical works. However, one notable exception exists. A verse by Khūyī that appears in the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il is also found in the Rawzat al-Kuttāb wa Hadikat al-Aḥbāb of Abu Bakr bin Zaki al-Qunyabi, compiled around 1278. And this work contains a collection of letters exchanged between Abu Bakr bin Zaki and various Anatolian intellectuals. And based on the introduction of this inshāʼ, of this collection, we know that he studied under Badr ad-Din Yahya, a bureaucrat at the court of Izz-ad-Din Qaykawus II. And his letters indicate his engagement with the literary circles of his time. Given that Abu Bakr bin Zaki was clearly familiar with Khūyī's works and that his laqab was Sadr, he may even be one of the potential addressees of Khūyī's verses in the Ṭirāz al-Rasā'il. Turning now to the Rawā'i'I al-afkār, this work is a qasideh badā'i'I or a rhetorical qasideh structured around various rhetorical devices in praise of a Seljuk ruler, Kilij Arslan IV. And the poem is dedicated to him, though he's mentioned only once in the following couplet. And Kilij Arslan IV ruled the Rum Sultanate between 1248 and 1265, with a 2-year interruption between 54 and 56. And he was the sole ruler only during the last 4 years of his reign. Since Khūyī was active in northern Anatolia in the 1280s and still writing in 1309, by which time he was certainly not a young man, he must have been quite young when he composed odes to Kilij Arslan IV, likely in the early 1260s. Unfortunately, the qasideh contains no specific details about Kilij Arslan IV, that would allow for a more precise dating of the poem. Nevertheless, we can confidently state that this work and the Ṭirāz or al-Rasā'il are among Khūyī's earliest surviving compositions. The Tübingen manuscript was likely created as a practical reference for composing letters, allowing scribes to locate and insert suitable lines of poetry and Quranic verses and hadith quotations as needed. Considering the four works of Khūyī and Rashid ad-Din Watwat's Sat Kalameh, which contains sayings of Ali with versified Persian translation, as well as the Rawdat al-Insan of Shihab al-Khasi, which collects aphorisms on humanity and generosity. This collection would have been an exceptionally useful manual for secretaries and literati alike. And at this point, I must refer to another manuscript of Khūyī's works kept at the Marashi Library in Qom. And this manuscript is also a majmu'ah and contains 10 treatises, including the following 5 works of Khūyī. The Qawā'id al-Rasā'il, the Ṭirāz al-Rasā'il, a short treatise entitled Miyar al-ash'ār al-shamsiyya, the Rawā'i'u al-afkār, and the Nuzhat al-Kuttāb. It was copied in 1343-44, making it the second oldest known Khūyī manuscript after the Fatih 5406, which is held in the Sulaymaniya Library, copied in 1309-1310. But as you can see, the Marashi and Tübingen manuscripts follow almost the same order of works. Unfortunately for my analysis, I primarily rely on the catalogue and correspondence with a colleague who has examined the Marashi manuscript. But based on this information, the second half of the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il appears to be missing. And here it should also be noted that in the edition of Khūyī's works, Abbāszadeh, relying on the Fatih manuscript, mistakenly identified a story in Arabic about the Barmakid Yahya ibn Khalid and his son Jafar concerning generosity as the beginning of the treatise. However, this is not the case. The story is unrelated and based on the Tübingen and the Marashi manuscripts, the actual beginning of the treatise comes after this, starting with the phrase "Behtari maqal hamd Hazrat Afaridagare Zul Jalal," or the best words are the praise of the Almighty Creator, who, etc. Furthermore, at the end of the treatise's edition, several additional verses appear, as found in a manuscript from the Malek Library in Tehran, tentatively dated to the 16th century according to the catalogue. However, these verses are absent from both the Tübingen and the Marashi manuscripts. Interestingly, these two manuscripts share a very similar concise ending before the mentioning of the date after the Ittifaq of Tadkir, and this ending differs significantly from the much longer version presented in the edition of the work, which is primarily based on the mentioned Malek manuscript from the 16th century, since the second half of the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il is missing in the Fatih manuscript. The next work in the Marashi manuscript is the Ṭirāz al-Rasā'il, though it is heavily defective. The introduction, the first half of the first section, which contains the Arabic supplications, and the entire third section are completely missing. But what's interesting for us is that, as I previously mentioned, in the Tübingen manuscript, the second subheading announces the beginning of the 3-line oaths, yet instead the 5-line oaths appear. Interestingly, the same inconsistency is present in the Marashi manuscript. And importantly, the only complete version of the Ṭirāz al-Rasā'il can be found in the Tübingen manuscript. Nevertheless, the Marashi Majmu'ah contains the Miyar al-ash'ār al-shamsiyya, which, as far as I'm aware, has no other surviving copies. And this short treatise on aruz or prosody comprises only 11 folios and written at the request of a certain Shams ad-Din Umar bin Muhammad Shirazi, who was evidently someone who he sought to impress or from whom he hoped to gain patronage. The Ma'yar al-Ash'ār addresses elements of verse, meter, and rhyme, explaining their vocabulary and terminological meanings. Interestingly, the work shares its title with a treatise by Nasir ad-Din Tusi from 1253-54, also on prosody. And since I'm definitely not an expert in aruz, I will refrain from making further observations, but a comparative study of the treatises by Tusi and Khūyī could prove valuable. At this point, it's worth pointing out Nasir ad-Din Tusi's influence on Khūyī's worldview and thinking. Khūyī, in his works, such as the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il, the Ghonyat al-Kuttāb, and the Rusūm al-Rasā'il, divides society into two primary groups, the pillars of state and the dignitaries of religion. And although the terminology regarding the designation of the categories varies across his works, so for instance, it's Sanf in the Qawā'id al-Rasā'il, Ta'ifa in the Ghonyat al-Kuttāb, and Fariq in the Rusūm al-Rasā'il. But this underlying structure remains consistent. And Khūyī's social model bears a resemblance to Nasir ad-Din Tusi's social model, which categorizes society into four functional groups. And Khūyī even employs the same terms such as Sanf and Tabaqah to classify social groups. And Tusi's model, which he set out in his famous work on ethics, the Akhlaq al-Nasiri, became a normative framework in the Persianate world, and it posits that differences in social function correspond to variations in intellectual capacities and moral qualities. And Tusi's hierarchy extends beyond society at large to individual professions, where masters of a craft are deemed superior to those less adept. And a key feature of Tusi's social model is the distinction between the occupations of the sword and the pen, representing the military and civilian functions of government, respectively. And this binary classification, which became a standard feature of social models from the 13th century onwards, is not evident in Khūyī's works. As you can see, Khūyī draws a fundamental distinction between those associated with political power, the Arkan-e-Dawlat, and those dedicated to upholding religion, the Ayān-e-Dīn. And in all three of his works, he lists secretaries and bureaucrats attached to the central government within the first category, together with sultans, viziers, and military commanders. And he also includes provincial officials and even craftsmen in this group, although he assigns them to a lower level. And Khūyī places religious figures and functionaries of all kinds in the second category. And somewhat unexpectedly, he also includes physicians, astronomers, poets, and men of letters in this group, despite the fact that such persons were often attached to royal patrons or high-ranking patrons. And while social models, of course, social models of this kind were often theoretical, Khūyī's deviations from the standard classification may suggest a possible reflection of the socio-political realities of Anatolia. His framework highlights a sharp disparity between the world of the court and that of religious institutions, relegating the religious elite to a lower status than their administrative counterparts. And this arrangement may indicate some sort of adaptation to specific Anatolian socio-political structures. However, we should not overlook the fact that Khūyī himself was a member of the administrative elite, so it would not be surprising to see a deliberate attempt to place the bureaucratic class in the highest position possible. Unfortunately, Khūyī does not delve into justifying his stance. Nevertheless, Khūyī's adoption of Tusi's model is particularly significant as it represents the earliest instance in inshāʼ literature where social rank explicitly dictates the structure and arrangement of the content. And these three works, the Qawā'id, al-Rasā'il, the Anatolia, and the Ḥusām al-Dīn, are all organized according to the principle of rank, with formulas of address, the khitabat, and the model letters tailored to the social status of the addressee. But let's return to his work on Aruz or prosody, the Mayor al-Ash'ār. From our perspective, what is particularly noteworthy is that in this work, Khūyī recounts a statement from one of his teachers, Amir al-Addi Yahya, whom he describes as the model of Konya's learned man, that he had heard from the Malik al-Shu'ara of Rum regarding a metrical criticism of al-Mutanabbi. And this Malik al-Shu'ara is almost certainly Bahauddin Khanī Tusi, who composed the Seljuk Name, modeled on Ferdowsi's Shahnameh for the Rum Seljuk ruler Kayqubad I, which is now lost, and also authored a versified Kalilabadimna for Kay Khosrow II. And Khanī remained active in Konya at the Seljuk court until 1273. So based on this comment, along with the fact that the Rawā'i'l al-afkār was composed for Kilijar Arslan IV, it would seem that Khūyī resided in Konya in the 60s and 70s. He likely learned the scribal profession from this al-Addi Yahya and attempted to establish a career there. However, considering his laments in the Ṭirāz al-Rasā'il and his later move or relocation to Kastamonu by the 1280s at the latest, it seems that he was unable to secure a stable position in Konya and he was compelled to seek employment elsewhere. This is, of course, an experience all too familiar to postdocs today. Nevertheless, Khūyī ultimately found success in Kastamonu, where he spent nearly 3 decades. But returning to the Marashi manuscript, following the Mayor al-Ash'ār comes the Rawā'i'l al-afkār, followed by another inshāʼ by Nizam ad-Din Muhammad bin Naqib, and also the previously mentioned Nuzhat al-Kuttāb, and finally Khūyī's Nuzhat al-Kuttāb. And as I've already noted, the Nuzhat al-Kuttāb was Khūyī's most widely disseminated work. Yet it survives in only one complete copy, which is also the oldest one, the Fatih 5406. However, we can now add the Marashi and Tübingen manuscripts to the textual tradition. Notably, but at this point, not at all surprisingly, the fourth and last chapter of the Nuzhat al-Kuttāb, which presents Arabic verses composed by Khūyī with Persian translations for embellishing letters. So this fourth chapter concludes with the same exact verse in both the Tübingen and the Marashi manuscripts. By contrast, the Fatih or the Malik manuscripts differ significantly, with the Malik manuscript in particular continuing for an additional 30 verse lines. So the works of Khūyī in the Tübingen and Marashi manuscripts are closely related, not only in terms of the included works and their order, but also in their incipits, explicits, distinctive features, and even textual arrangement. And this strongly suggests that if one were to construct a stemma codicum of all extant Khūyī manuscripts, these two would undoubtedly descend from a common ancestor. In conclusion, Ḥusām al-Dīn Khūyī was clearly one of the most prolific writers in the genre of inshāʼ during the medieval period. And this fact is also highlighted by these lesser-known works in the Tübingen and Marashi manuscripts. Although no original state documents from 13th century Anatolia have survived, Khūyī's works serve as clear testaments to the presence of an active bureaucratic apparatus, even in a remote border region like Kastamonu. And Khūyī's literary oeuvre has a distinctly didactic nature, evident even before his move to Kastamonu, indicating a broader demand for materials on letter writing and drafting state documents in late 13th century Anatolia. And while a full exploration of this topic lies beyond our current scope, it is worth mentioning that the influence of Central Asian models, especially in the al-Tawassul al-Tarassul of Baha'u'llah Baghdadi, is striking in some of Khūyī's sample writings. As Andrew Peacock has noted, works from Central Asia gained increasing popularity by the mid-13th century. And in contrast to other, particularly later inshāʼ treatises, Khūyī's works exhibit a strong pragmatic orientation. His works served as a treasury or bank for literary and rhetorical exemplars and their corresponding ideals. They were designed to serve as a reference tool for scribes and secretaries drafting correspondence, particularly in Kastamonu and possibly other Anatolian cities. Furthermore, Khūyī's integration of Nasir ad-Din Tusi's modified model into epistolography through the arrangement of the material represents a significant development and demonstrates a quite innovative application of political philosophy to bureaucratic practice. I will leave it there for discussion. Thank you very much.